All right, everybody, thanks for joining for the August 5th EPAC meeting. I sent around an agenda last week along with some slides. Additional slides were posted to the meeting matter on the EPAC website and the DPS website. But today the agenda is to walk through another batch of results that we have for you all. These are the scenario 3 capacity expansion results. We've already walked through in the last two meetings the scenario 1 and scenario 2 capacity expansion results. So we're coming back with the third and final set of capacity expansion results for the CGPP scenarios. If we have time, we also want to start the conversation around additional sensitivities that we might want to run on these three scenarios, because we are kind of getting short on time in this stage 1 capacity expansion model. We really want to get moving and move through the preceding stages as quickly as we can to make sure we stay on schedule. So we wanted to begin that conversation today. But I think we're going to start with the scenario 3 results with the NYISO presenting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Keith and the team to take it away.
Thanks, Skylar. Our primary presenter today is going to be Kevin Roberts from the NYISO to walk through the scenario 3 slides. These have been posted out for the last several days on the EPAC website. Kevin, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Keith. Let me pull my slides here. All right, so got the slides showing here. First and foremost, from my end, there's a little bit of construction happening at my apartment. So my sincere apologies if you can hear that. It starts at this time every day. And of course, it's this time for EPAC today. But let me just dive right into the slides here. So as Skylar mentioned, we're going to be discussing the scenario 3 results. And let me talk about the agenda for that today. So I'm going to go over the key assumptions first and foremost. So like what has changed relative to the state scenario for scenario 3 here. And in addition, we'll present the results both out at a NICA and zonal level. But I think actually this section is part of the slides, but we'll mostly get into the CGPP scenario comparison, and that's where I'll show all 3 scenarios at one time, just for the sake of not being repetitive here. And then finally, we have the appendix, which has been fairly standard with the slides that we've been sharing to date. So that is also included in these slides. So just giving a quick overview, the starting point for scenario 3 again is the state scenario. And to date, we've presented state scenario results at EPAC in June, and then we had scenario 2 results were presented in July. So if you missed that, I believe the slides are available on the EPAC website, but I think some of this is also on YouTube. So that stuff is there if you're interested. And then just a note here, scenario 3 is labeled by the joint utilities as a high transmission impact scenario. And I believe the assumptions here are meant to stress the transmission system. And so hence the labeling. And just a note, the assumption changes for scenario 3 were provided by the joint utilities. So getting into the key assumptions here, key assumption changes. So the changes relative to the state scenario include the following. So we have a new load profile that includes an increased energy demand, and this is per a different integration analysis scenario that has higher demand. But there's also the inclusion of large loads, but those large loads remain consistent with the state scenario. And then we also have removed the EV load flexibility in this scenario. The flexibility of load is something that is considered something that could ease the transmission burden, so we've removed that. And then we also have changed the hydrogen defer technology. And in the state scenario, this is modeled as simple cycle and combined cycle combustion turbines. But in scenario 3 here, this technology is replaced by hydrogen fuel cells. So hydrogen fuel cells are the only, like, quote unquote defer capacity expansion candidate. And this is really important. So I want to point this out so folks remember as we continue, and we'll discuss why that's important going forward. But outside of these 3 main assumption changes, all other assumptions remain consistent with the state scenario. And in addition, attached with this presentation, and I believe posted on the EPAC website, we have like an assumptions matrix that details all the assumptions for these scenarios used in CGPP as well as the outlook. So that's available for folks to reference. So just making an effort here to like quantify these assumption changes. When we look at how the load changed from an energy perspective, so energy being the total amount of energy demanded in a year, and then at peak being, you know, the highest hour of demand within a year, we can see that in scenario 3, we have a 15 terawatt hour higher energy when comparing 2042 here. And on the peak side, we have a 5 gigawatt higher peak. And we've also made an effort just to show this in different ways. So this is just showing how the load changes from a representative day perspective, and the representative day being the main time periods that the model sees and makes its decision based on. And the black line being, the black lines really, the solid as well as dashed, are from the state scenario. And then the blue lines are from scenario 3. So just so you can see how things change from this perspective. But we've also quantified it on just on peak, you know, one of the most important periods that we look at. We're showing winter peak comparison, and this is more side by side rather than having that data on top of each other in the last slide. And, you know, again, you're able to see how much more load is increasing. But one of the important pieces here is in the state scenario in scenario 2, the sort of dotted line rather than the dashed line. The dotted line has a flex load component where the model is able to optimize how to flex load in different periods. Scenario 3 doesn't have that. And so that's why you don't see that line in this case. So just looking at winter peak, and we also provided the data for summer peak. And those slides cover load at this point. And there's a couple additional assumptions here that we think are important to talk about just from a results perspective. So on the headroom side, and we wanted to make sure, you know, we clarify the headroom assumption for folks. And I know this has been part of the conversations in the past, but in the capacity expansion model, we have this representation of headroom. And what that is meant to be is a proxy representation of local transmission capability. You know, and this is kind of intended to be like a bridge between a bubble / zonal model, which only really models the main transmission interfaces between zones, versus a nodal model, where a nodal model really has a very detailed representation of the full transmission system. So because we don't have that transmission system explicitly modeled, the local transmission system, headroom is meant to be a representation of that local transmission capability. So the headroom values that we are using in the model are provided or have been provided by the joint utilities. And it's something that for zones A through I and K is directly tied to hourly generation. So if a zone wants to increase its maximum generation capability as it builds more resources, it will also need to build additional headroom, additional, quote unquote, transmission capability to accommodate that additional generation. However, there's one difference with respect to Zone J here. The Zone J headroom is only constrained to the offshore wind capacity. It's not generation specifically. And, this is just something we wanted to highlight as we get into the results. And we'll see a lot of additional builds in the scenario in Zone J. And part of that could be driven by this assumption here. And just to remind folks, there's a cost associated with adding headroom in the model, and it essentially compounds at 15%. And it does so for every 1 gigawatt of additional headroom that the model requires. So as more headroom is added, the cost increases fairly significantly. Another key assumption with respect to scenario 3 here is the assumed capacity limitations. So, we added a pretty significant amount of load to the model. And to some extent, the model becomes constrained with respect to what resources it can use to add additional capacity to serve that additional load. So it's important to note that we have certain capacity limitations imposed here. So for example, what's being shown in this chart is the capacity limitations according to the supply curve analysis that was performed by NYSERDA. And so what this data is used as, an input to the model, a constraint to the model that says you can only build a certain amount of land-based wind in zones A through G, for example, and represented by this lighter green bar. Or furthermore, you can only build this amount of capacity for solar in these zones as well. And then you have your limits on the offshore wind. What's important to note is that in the state scenario, and even happening in scenario 3, is the land-based wind capacity is essentially maxed out. So it can't build any more of that resource. And then in addition, what's not being shown here, but my second point labeled here, is at a NICA level for UPV, there's an implementation of a build limit over the years that's about 2.5 gigawatts per year, where the model cannot build more than that amount of solar over the time period that's being modeled. So this, what I've just mentioned here, is actually more limiting than the UPV VARs that are here, right? It ends up hitting that constraint before it hits the supply curve constraint. So just want to make a note of that, and we can revisit this as I discuss the results. And then one more additional key point on the assumptions is we were provided ELCC curves by NYSERDA, and this is showing Zone J ELCC curves for battery storage. The dark blue bar being the 4-hour battery storage, and the orange bar, or the orange line, being 8-hour battery storage. And if you're interested in these curves, by the way, they are available on the EPAC website, and you can have a look at those. But essentially, we found that in scenario 3, that the model was actually building up to the endpoint of these curves. So let me also specify, the dark blue, the solid line, is what was provided for each of these. And we found that the battery storage was actually hitting these endpoints of the lines that was provided. So, 4-hour storage is getting built about 11 gigawatts, and the 8-hour storage was building about 5 gigawatts. And we essentially just wanted to make sure that this wasn't constraining the model, or this was not an intended constraint in the model. So we had a discussion with DPS and the joint utilities on, if this should be extrapolated to accommodate more capacity if the model chose to do so. And we came up with a methodology for keeping the general trends consistent for that additional capacity. So that's where we come to the dotted lines. That's how we decided to implement a extension of these curves. So there was a lot of discussion around that. However, when we finally implemented this extension of the curve, the model did not opt to build more battery capacity. So therefore, this change has minimal impact, but we wanted to highlight it. And in addition, this was only a concern with Zone J storage. There's curves provided for other resources in other zones, but the model did not come close to meeting the ends of those curves. So that brings me to the end of this section where I discuss the assumptions. Now let me get into the results. And, similar to last presentations, we have a kind of a standard set of results that we're presenting for each scenario. And so this set of slides that we have is scenario 3 specific. So you can have a look at those as you wish. But what I'm going to get into is really the comparison. So let me jump there. And so here are the key findings with respect to scenario 3. And first, starting at the NICA level. So to accommodate the 15 terawatt of additional load, we're really seeing this additional need being met by offshore wind. And then finally, with the increase of peak, we have the 5 gigawatt additional peak load, just from changing the load. And then we have the removal of the flexible loads, which is roughly the equivalent of adding another 3.5 gigawatts on peak. So we're talking about a change at peak of around 8.5 gigawatts. And the results are showing an additional amount of battery capacity. And the why this is the peak numbers are important because it has an impact on the IRM and the LCR. So the amount of capacity that we need statewide and we also need in local regions downstate. So that's one piece that's happening that's driving additional resources. But there's also a second reason why we have more like nameplate capacity in this scenario 3. So you'll see a lot of additional battery capacity in scenario 3. And this is due to the replacement of the combustion turbines as the DEFR expansion candidate, so the hydrogen expansion candidate. And so the combustion turbines are being replaced with fuel cells. And these fuel cells are really more expensive, especially relative to the battery. And it's also especially without a retrofit option. So what we had in state scenario is these DEFR units were related to existing units that could retrofit, and instead of burning fossil, they could burn hydrogen. And when we do this change, when we add this more expensive DEFR option, the results are showing that the battery, even though it has a lower firm capacity, and that's driven by like ELCCs, even though there's more nameplate capacity required, the model is still finding the battery to be more economic than the hydrogen in this scenario. So this is what's driving, I think, and perhaps most driving of the additional battery that you'll see in these results. And just one final point, going back to the capacity, limitations that I was discussing earlier, you have these UPV and land-based wind limits that are close to or have reached their maximum available capacity. And so the model doesn't really have the option to build those resources. And that's why you won't see any more of them. So
Question on the phone.
Yeah.
Chris Wentland, with respect to the fuel cells, what's the duration that you're assuming that a fuel cell could perform to? Is it hours or days? What are you assuming?
So the fuel cells, and I will admit I'm not a fuel cell expert, but from what we've done in the modeling, the fuel cells are able to operate in a similar capacity or a similar fashion as the combustion turbines. It's just mostly comes down to different cost assumptions, but from an operating perspective, they're assumed to be similar to a combustion resource.
So if you needed them for multiple days, they would be able to perform?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And then the second question to that is, in the model, did you do any assumptions on how do you transport the fuel to the actual site where the fuel cell is sited?
Yeah, great question, Chris. With respect to the transportation of fuel, no, that is not considered as part of this model. And that's also the same for all of the CGPP scenarios. It's not specifically, it is not specifically considered the transportation piece.
Yep,
Okay,
just
so-
with one addition there, the like physical constraints that storage and transportation of, say, a hydrogen fuel or compression or something like that, that's not in the model anywhere. There's nowhere in Plexos that you can put, siting constraints or limiting like that. But we did add a cost. The fuel cost to purchase the hydrogen does include the cost of having to transport and store hydrogen.
Okay. And like the transport, Skylar, are you assuming vehicle transport or pipeline transport?
I think the assumptions that go into the cost assume some mix of those resources being used, both pipeline where available, but trucking and storage where pipelines are not available.
Okay, thank you.
And there's more information on that hydrogen assumption and how that storage and transportation costs break down in the integration analysis appendices.
Great. Thanks, Skylar. Appreciate it. So without further ado, let me start showing some of these results here. So now what you'll see in a lot of these slides here is all of the scenarios being compared together. So, with this third scenario, I'm going to focus mostly on the third scenario here. You can see that addition of more load and then how that impacts the batteries. A significant amount more battery. And let me jump to the next slide here because it shows the delta. So this is like, for example, this bar here is just the delta between 2042 in scenario 3 to the state scenario for capacity and generation. And just do the generation piece first, you can see that most of the additional demand is being met by offshore wind. And then you can see that significant swap between the hydrogen defer capacity to batteries instead, again, driven by both the demand, but largely from the more expensive hydrogen units. And when we look at that from, getting into zonal and regional comparisons from an upstate versus downstate perspective, again, don't want to be too repetitive, but we're not seeing any increase in land-based wind UPV. And the majority of the additional nameplate capacity is added downstate. And we have the varying amounts up or down listed here. But I'll just get into the chart.
One sec. Could we pause for 1 second? There's another question on the line.
Absolutely.
that's mine, correct, Skylar Vatika?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I have a question on this comment and finding that offshore wind, more offshore wind is added in downstate. Can you clarify, is that based on the economics or on increasing the targets for offshore wind, or is it capacity driven? I'm just like, what's causing to have more offshore wind?
Yeah, the reason for more offshore wind, I think, is, we have to get the energy from somewhere, essentially. And at this point in the model, the land-based wind was maxed out in the state scenario. So with more demand in this scenario 3, we can't build more of that. The UPV is also maxed out in the state scenario. And so in scenario 3, the load increases, can't build more UPV either. The hydrogen is super expensive and also will incur additional electrolysis load. So that is not seen as optimum. And so finally, offshore wind becomes the only option that's left, and it will provide a significant amount of energy. It has a fairly high cost as well, but it's really for the additional energy that's needed. It has to go to offshore wind because it's limited in its other options. Does that help?
Yes, very helpful. And when you say onshore wind and solar are maxed out, do you mean like the potential resource was used already up to now? So even if we were to build transmission, you simply don't have solar and wind anymore in the state based on the potential resource data?
Yes, that's right. According to data that's been provided by NYSERDA, they did a big statewide analysis where they looked at resource potential in different zones. So on the land-based wind, it is specifically saying that I think the supply curve indicates that there's almost a land constraint. And NYSERDA folks can check me on this if I'm saying anything that's not correct. But from a land-based wind perspective, there's only so much room to build the wind farms. And so the model takes that into consideration. And for land-based wind specifically, that is the reason for the limit. But on the UPV side, NYSERDA also did that analysis, how much UPV can we fit in different zones. And while there's a significant amount of UPV available upstate, different locations available, that is not the limiting factor, the land availability or the supply curve analysis that was done. There's an additional limiting factor on the UPV, which is, it's like 2.5 gigawatts per year, like an amount of UPV that can just physically be built. And I think the logic behind that is more of what's a realistic amount of projects that can be done. So that's kind of a separate assumption. And if any other folks want to help clarify that, certainly chime in, but hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you.
All right, so getting back into the slides here, I'm going to go to the zonal level. So on the zonal level, we're seeing a similar zonal distribution in zones A through F, so kind of those upstate zones, but there's an offset of hydrogen for battery. In GH and I, you've got a similar distribution. Zone J, you're getting primarily more battery, and zone K, we got more battery, more offshore wind, and then the hydrogen goes away because it becomes more expensive as it changes to the fuel cell option here. So this is now putting all three scenarios zonally together. I think the next slide I have helps do that comparison more directly. So we have the different zones, and then state scenario is double S here, and S2 and S3. So now we can more easily compare what's happening on a zonal level. And, you can see here a significant amount of battery storage ending up in zone J. There's a few reasons, or at least one reason why the model might prefer J over the other zones, and it may find efficiency with respect to the LCRs. So zone building capacity in zone J has a lot of value because the LCRs are in different layers here. So the capacity for zone J also contributes to statewide capacity. So there's like an efficiency bonus with zone J here. And we're also seeing more storage in zone K instead of the hydrogen capacity. And so furthermore here, one other key point is the model did add more offshore wind, right, to accommodate this additional energy. And that was primarily built in zone K. And that leads me to my next slide here on headroom. Because we needed more offshore wind in zone K in this scenario, we also needed additional headroom in zone K to accommodate that. So that's why when you see the headroom numbers reported, you'll see a lot higher headroom in K. And this is showing the storage breakdown by scenario, but also breaking it down from 4-hour and 8-hour storage. So you can see more 8-hour storage being built in this case and coming online a little bit earlier, as opposed to 2040 in the state scenario. In scenario 2, the 8 hours now coming online in 2035. And then finally here, in the comparison of the hydrogen build, you'll see how those fuel cells got distributed in scenario 3. So, it's not a retrofit option. It has a higher cost associated with it, but it still ends up in zones G, H, and I, as well as J, because it has, higher firm capacity. And in this instance, it found that as an economic build to build the new capacity. So I know I covered a lot here, and that is the end of my intended presentation. Again, appendix information is here. So just a reminder for folks to have a look at that. But at this point, I'll open up the floor to questions and let me know what you have.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Skylar. Just one other question. If you could go back to zone J on the energy storage, kind of going out, and you're looking at, it looks like up to about 12 gigawatts of energy storage over time. Are you, a couple questions. Are you assuming a certain amount of acreage required for every, say, 100 megawatts of storage? And then the second question is, are you assuming utilization of current like industrial or brownfield properties versus greenfield, just because of space limitations?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chris. There's no specific constraint with respect to land for these battery resources. So the model isn't tied to any sort of land limitation, and therefore we don't consider like the brownfield piece either.
Okay, so you basically just assume you can find the land to site 12 gigawatts of storage in zone J.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Hey, Kevin, this is Keith. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but doesn't that tie back in some regards to and maybe this is a question for DPS or NYSERDA, the given capacity limitations that were provided by the NYISO for use? I think some review of land constraints was considered in that.
I think, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the question, Keith. I think that limitation and analysis was done for renewable, mostly like land-based wind, UPV, and offshore wind, but was not considered for battery specifically. So therefore, it's not nothing is limiting the battery.
Yeah, just to add a little bit of background also, we've done a bit of analysis on this, on data from the NYSERDA Energy Storage Program and in the Energy Storage Roadmap that looks at kind of space constraints for energy storage. And it usually comes out to around 30 to 40 megawatts per acre. So that can, eventually somebody can do that math quick and figure out how many acres that is somewhere in or around Zone J. But this is showing, roughly 11 gigawatts of 4-hour storage and then another 5-ish gigawatts of 8-hour storage for a little bit over 16 gigawatts. So that is a phenomenal amount of energy storage going into one zone. And so now we've seen what a optimization model would do that, can't necessarily see physics or the space constraint that we have here. And it's up to us to kind of interpret all of these results, do additional analysis, and layer that on any future recommendations or programs that we're looking at.
Any other questions from folks here? All right, hearing none. With that, Skylar, I think I can turn it back to you, unless anyone wants the last minute chime in.
Yeah, I think I'll wait about 10 more seconds to see if anybody raises their hand or comes off mute, and then we can hand it over to the JU to start our discussion on sensitivities. I know these capacity expansion results are a lot to take in. There's just so much data on every slide. I really appreciate the NYSO putting down the comparison on all of these things. I think it's very useful to see how small tweaks in assumptions lead to big changes in some of the results. It gives us a lot of data to dig into and move through the rest of this process, which is great. Now that we've seen kind of the 3 quote unquote base scenarios that were developed throughout the course of this process, and we have those results, hopefully that gives people a lot to think about, about how those scenarios were different, what people might be interested in changing about one or all of those scenarios to test some useful pieces of information. But now I wanted to kind of move it over to the JU to start the discussion on how we're thinking about sensitivities that might need to be developed and what kind of our requirements are under the order and what the process will be moving forward. So I'm not sure who I'm handing it off to. Is it Tom? Is that going to be you or Chris?
Yeah, I'll do some of the talking, and Chris, if you don't mind helping share the slides, I'd appreciate it. And Chris and a few other planners are here to keep me out of trouble if we get too far into the weeds. So we might have some tag teaming going on, but I'll be leading the discussion here for the joint utilities. So as Skylar previewed there, we're talking about sensitivities and next steps primarily here, building off of the scenario results we just got the final look at. So Chris, if you jump to the next slide, I'll talk through the agenda. We're going to talk about sensitivities, how they're different from scenarios, how they align, really talk about the first couple sensitivities that we've already started to implement in alignment with the order from the commission, and then talk about subsequent sensitivities, how we're going to decide which ones are important, how we're going to solicit your input, and what are some of the ones we've already started talking about and thinking about, maybe some low-hanging fruit in terms of options. And then a little later, if we have time, we'll talk about some next steps, just get you a better understanding of what we're doing here in stage 2, and then just a refresher on the CGPB cycle calendar, and give you the ability to go back and look at some of the order steps in a little more detail now that we're getting closer to these steps through stage 2. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. Please, we look forward to your input. through these EPAC sessions, and I think there'll be opportunities for input moving forward as well. So you don't have to get it all in live here. With that, maybe we'll jump to the next slide. Excellent. So scenarios and sensitivities, as you know, the joint utilities have engaged the NYISO through a REPS agreement, a requested economic planning study agreement, which allowed us to build out the 3 scenarios, which NYISO kindly and aptly just delivered on and shared with the rest of EPAC here. Beyond those 3 scenarios that we've just gone through, we have also got the opportunity to evaluate up to 10 sensitivity configurations with the NYISO. So a sensitivity, something typically involves just 1 or 2 assumption changes as opposed to the scenarios, which are really meant more as bookends. And one thing we want to emphasize through this graphic on the bottom here, as you can see, we have our 3 scenarios, our low transmission impact bookend, our high transmission impact bookend, and then our state scenario, which aligns closely with the NYISO's outlook policy state scenario. But when we say 10 sensitivities, it's important to understand that this is among all the scenarios, not each. So for example, if we were to implement 1 sensitivity across all 3 scenarios to see the impact it had among all of them, that would count as 3, not 1 sensitivity. So with that clarification, we'll move on to talk about the initial sensitivity we've gone forward and implemented, and we'll talk about why we went ahead with that. Primarily timing, and because we think it's perfectly in alignment with the order. So from the order, the PSC directed us to the joint utilities assess whether bulk transmission constraints have an effect on the economic build out of renewable generation. Essentially, the way that we've chosen to test that, at least at first here, to get a high level look, and there may be more sensitivities in the future that look at bulk, we did what's called a copper sheet. For once, us engineers came up with a good name for something, not some long acronym. This is actually apt. What we mean when we say copper sheet is as if you draped an actual copper sheet over the electrical grid such that electrons can flow freely. I'll be more specific by what we mean, which specific constraints we alleviated. So in the first sensitivity, the first copper sheet sensitivity here, we eliminated the interzonal interface transfer limits. So for example, any constraints that NYISO would have imposed between zone A or zone B, or between any of the zones, for example, those have been totally eliminated so that the electrons have no constraint from moving from one zone to the other. As well, we've removed the local capacity requirements. These are intrazonal requirements related to generation capacity that has to be sited and utilized within that zone. That we can talk about a little bit more later, but we've eliminated those as well as part of this first copper sheet sensitivity. I will make a clarification on these slides. We have left the local headroom limitations intact, since this is really focused on bulk transmission, generally interzonal transmission, as opposed to local transmission, which generally is intrazonal, which aligns more with local headroom. So to clarify, the first copper sheet sensitivity eliminates local capacity requirements and interface transfer limits among zone or between zones, but does not affect local headroom limitations. Additionally, we did not modify the extra zonal, so outside of New York, i.e. how much power we can transfer with ISO New England or PJM or Canada, for example. Those were not changed for a number of reasons, really focusing on bulk interfaces within New York. While we were there, we figured it was valuable to utilize an additional sensitivity on just the state scenario, not all 3 scenarios, but the second sensitivity we implemented is the same as the first in that it eliminates the interzonal interface transfer limits, allowing free flow between zones, but it retains the local capacity requirements, i.e. the same as they were in the state scenario. And this is really just to make sure between these 2 sensitivities, we have the ability to isolate the impact of transmission of renewables, since LCRs are not technically a transmission constraint. They're more related to generation siting. I'll keep going on to the next slide that talks a little bit more about what we expect to get from these copper sheet sensitivities, how it aligns with the order. I want to put a big asterisk on everything we say here, though. I think when it comes to planning, we often have educated guesses about where things are going to go, but there's a reason we run these models, and often these evaluations have to be taken in consideration of the circumstances. So this is what we might expect to see and how we might expect to interpret it, but of course, we're withholding judgment until we actually see the results. What we think is that a copper sheet sensitivity that maintains the local capacity requirements will provide insight into the major upstate interfaces that could be good candidates for bulk system upgrades, such that if we see in that sensitivity lots of renewable generation moving from one upstate zone to another, or much more renewable being sited in a way that allows for flow between zones in the upstate region, then bulk system upgrades might make sense, particularly in those upstate regions. Whereas if it doesn't materially change, it could indicate that bulk, at least between zones, might not be as valuable, though, again, that's another place where we have to put a big asterisk and look at the actual results to understand what they mean before we make a judgment. In the case without the local capacity requirements, we expect the build out to change, especially since those local capacity requirements tend to site generation in zones where maybe they wouldn't be economic. You know, it's like hard coding in the models. We think a much higher build out of renewables upstate under this without local capacity requirements could show a need for bulk interface upgrades, potentially different bulk interface upgrades, more upstate downstate type upgrades. But again, we have to look. And again, there might be some insights into how we handle New York City if we want to gauge a new paradigm, potentially importing renewables or something like that. If the generation doesn't move upstate, but still wants to find its way into those downstate zones. This is just to show that a lot of this is complicated. We did do these sensitivities in a way that was meant to complement each other and help us understand, and particularly, I think NYSO came up with this term, the tale of two grids, upstate versus downstate, and the challenges and trade-offs associated with generation siting upstate versus downstate, and the way bulk transmission might affect those upstate, downstate generation buildouts. So next, I'll go to talk about future sensitivities. So those are the 2 of the 10 we've implemented. Again, we feel like they're really appropriate just because the order really only directly calls for one type of sensitivity, and that's those that look at economic bulk interface capability upgrades. But I do want to talk about other sensitivities that we could choose, and we definitely are looking for input both here and through another process. I believe, you know, Skylar, correct me if I'm wrong, we're going to do a similar solicitation of input as we did for the scenarios, where we sort of ask the EPAC what sensitivities they think make sense, or to rank them in some way and provide some justification so that we can really consider them together to help emphasize time is of the essence. So correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that's what we discussed.
Yep, that's right.
Thank you, Skylar. So in considering what input you might have in the future, we want to talk about the purpose of these supplemental sensitivities, particularly this late in the process. We're going to look a little later at the timeline and where we're at, but we're just trying our best to keep up with the schedule, maybe slightly behind. So we want to do this in a way that it doesn't put us further behind of the schedule, if at all. So we think that we could use these to calibrate our confidence in the proposed solutions developed for CGPP scenarios. So what I mean by this is we don't necessarily expect to have the time to do full transmission buildouts that are dedicated to each individual sensitivity, but instead maybe test buildouts for the scenarios among the sensitivities, or use the sensitivities as context in interpreting the scenario results to see which ones maybe are higher value or lower value or present less risk for investment to the commission or to the state. And then probably more importantly, inform construction of scenarios in the future CGPP cycles, which are fast approaching. As all of you saw in the initial process, a lot of it is equal parts art and science, you know, in predicting the future here, particularly under such a seismic change as the climate, as the clean energy transition. So we really feel like these sensitivities could be highly instructive in which scenarios we lay out for the next CGPP cycle. I want to jump to the bottom before I talk. Oh, please.
Yeah, there's just a hand in the chat. Radhika?
Thank you. I have maybe 2 questions. One, it's on the process with this in particular, the bulk sensitivity that the order refers to. So is this to be done in the nodal models as opposed to the capacity expansion modeling in phase 1? I'm just confused on who is to do the sensitivity and at what level of modeling, zonal or nodal?
So for the bulk sensitivities, at least the ones that I just described, NISO is right now in the process of running them through for us. So we'll be able to see those as if they were stage one. So
Okay.
those bulk sensitivities will apply to the capacity expansion.
Okay. Okay. And then I do have a question on the other question is on the like copper sheet sensitivities. So you are saying that you are not changing the constraints in each zone, the constraints within the zone, like those headroom values, but you are relaxing or increasing the interfaces between different zones. But doesn't that limit how much renewables you are adding in each zone because you are still constraining based on intrazone constraints?
You'd be right. That's still going to be a limitation, but we have to look back to our purpose here. A true copper sheet might not illuminate specifically bulk transmission constraints. So we're going to be doing a detailed look at local transmission through stage 3. But what we want to do right now is make sure that we have a good understanding of whether bulk could make sense as a solution or not, because this is the point in the process where if bulk did make sense, NYSERDA would have to split off and do an independent investigation of bulk solutions so that the commission could have, an independent bulk option with or in juxtaposition to the local planning that we're doing soon.
And is I'm just thinking very simplistically, maybe too much, but too simplistically, because the way I see it is like, let's say you have this level, X level of build out, it's limited by the constraints within the zone. The bulk interfaces may not bind at this level of build out. However, if you allow the build out in a zone to be higher, the bulk interface could be binding because you allow more flows from a particular zone. So it seems to me that you are fixing the build out as opposed to saying what happens if you have both local and bulk solutions.
Hey, Veronica, this is Jeff Marr. I mean, my thought while you were speaking there was many of the other constraints in the model are not necessarily electrical constraints, right? So how much can be built per year? What's the total capability to be built in a zone? So these things represent more like real world or physical constraints. So, I don't think it would make sense to change those. And then when you think about like local headroom is not free, right? But the model is building a lot of headroom. So what we are seeing is that the model does need to build the headroom to support the generation that it's proposing to build across the state. And because the headroom cost is essentially uniform across at least upstate New York, the model can decide which zone it makes sense to build that headroom. So I don't think the headroom would overly constrain the model. It will represent the fact that there is a cost to build that generation, but I don't think it would limit the model from building it in A versus B or C versus D.
Thank you, Jeff. And this sensitivity to like relax copper sheet is based, so it is using like the build out you have is done in this capacity expansion models through 2042 or whatever the final year is, taking into account that you are increasing, in fact, this headroom every year or however the capacity expansion came back with. So you are saying that in fact the headroom values have increased from what it is today, and then on top of that, the sensitivity you will be allowing more flows at the bulk level.
Yeah, we start with the state scenario. So that was, the first scenario that was presented, and I know it was kind of a while ago. but we left all the assumptions the same, except for we eliminated those constraints between the zones
Okay.
within the state. So every other assumption would still be exactly the same.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. I still think maybe there is a universe there where like a full, at least in some areas, could be beneficial, just to see if there is an additional view out there with like more like a, could be, I know this name is hated, but or not liked much, the renewable energy zone, but Zone E, for instance, does show a lot of renewable potential. And I don't know if we are using, or if I get into that capacity, like maximum potential in Zone E, but that's one candidate where you could foresee that maybe there is room there for relaxing both constraints. But I understand what you
Radka.
said earlier. Thank you.
No, that's excellent input. Actually, exactly the type of input I think we're looking for. So I really strongly encourage you to articulate that through this solicitation process we're going to do here, because as you can see on the screen on the right, perfect transition over to the potential sensitivities. The first one on the list is additional bulk interface capability or relaxation cases that we really put it as a priority here. We want to make sure that we're running that to ground in a way that meets and satisfies the order. And part of that order is EPAC solicitation on what the bulk sensitivity should look like. So please include that when you reach out to us. And like we said, especially based on these initial results we're going to get soon here, we expect to do additional bulk sensitivities based on those results and depending on those results.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Of course. Before I go through the other potential sensitivities, I do want to turn your attention to the bottom in blue here. Again, big, huge, depending on timing, because getting these things through on time is critically important. As we saw from the midpoint review, we're even looking to maybe shorten time in the future. So time is of the essence, but depending on timing and the results, it is possible that the sensitivity could be promoted to a scenario if it is seen as valuable to the group. Particularly replacing the low transmission impact scenario that we noticed isn't substantially different from the state scenario in a way that we think would drive a substantially different transmission build out. So not hugely effective as a bookend or informative that our state scenario is already somewhat of a bookend, but there may be the opportunity to promote something if the timing works out well. So with that said, some of the other potential sensitivities we've been talking about, and again, don't let this limit your creativity. These are just ones that we think could be impactful and useful, but certainly more are we're interested in hearing about. This first one on the list is one that staff has shown some particular interest in, and we think could be interesting: a long duration storage as a candidate resource for DFIR, particularly since it has a very different looking assumption from hydrogen as far as upfront and ongoing operating costs go in the model. Could drive different results. Similarly, SMR nuclear as a candidate resource, we know that technology is coming quickly and could be valuable for our analysis and could drive different results. As you saw earlier, we didn't do a lot in terms of modifying import exports. So these last two talk about the opportunities there, either modifying imports exports from our domestic neighbors here, or even changing our imports from Ontario, particularly in the context that I know Canada's been really good to us in sending a lot of clean energy, but they're going to have their own energy needs, and that might become more bidirectional in the future. So again, not looking necessarily to have all of your input right now. I think it's important that you have some time to think through this and understand the purpose and digest it, and have a good forum to bring this back, similar to how we did this for the scenario development, but we wanted to get your heads in the right space. With that, I'll jump over to talk about what we're doing right now. This is stage 2, so moving from the capacity expansion modeling that NYSO so kindly just provided us with the final results from. We've really broken up the scope of work into 3 categories, and this is where, at least for the joint utilities, things start to become very busy, a lot of work, and we'll have some visuals to demonstrate what we're talking about in a second. But The three categories that we've broken this into for stage 2 is really development of models. So those seed cases for each of the study years we're looking at, 2030, 2035, 2042. Balancing those intra and inter area transfers for those seed cases, and then balancing load and generation, which we'll show again how much work that is in a little bit. Then translating zonal to nodal from a lot of what we've seen from the NISO so far. So determining generation profiles within each zone and how they might vary. This next bullet, a big one we spent a good amount of time talking about at the last EPAC meeting, is siting, placing that zonal level generation at specific substations and lines in a way that makes sense for the model and allows the model to run effectively, but also represents reality in some way. We know reality isn't perfectly optimal in terms of siting, so we don't want it to be a perfect engine. That's, like I talked about earlier, probably equal parts art and science, and why we have so many experienced planners helping us with that. And then building out the distribution level DER. This is a little more straightforward as a load modifier, something that we could probably lean on our distribution planning forecasts for, since they have a lot of experience in this area. And then lastly, we are going to be developing those auxiliary files. So looking at new contingencies and updating monitor and subsystem files. On the next slide, I'll show you a little visual that certainly helped me appreciate what's going on here among all the planners and modelers. So you see stage 2 on the left, I think kind of gave us this graphic, so thank you over there. But this opened my eyes to a lot of this. You see stage 2, we're building out for the 3 scenarios. Each one, we have to develop 12 databases, so 36 in total. That's one database for each season, the summer, winter, light load, and shoulder seasons. And then for each of those, a database for each model year that we just discussed. And then preparing for stage 3, where we're setting up those local design studies. So stage 3 will be starting with the short circuit, a number of power flow cases representing different contingency levels that are important for the transmission, as well as doing headroom and transfer limit analysis for each and every one of these databases that we've set up for the scenarios. So a substantial amount of setup work here that's going into the models and checking and rechecking to make sure everything is done in a way that makes sense, so that really we don't have to come back and look at some decision made at this step that has some high impact later that we might not want it to. So really spending the time here to make sure we're doing it right. Why it's one of the longer stages. So just lastly, on the next slide, a refresher, and I encourage folks to go back to both the joint utilities filing and the order. I think reading both of them together really gives great context on what we're doing here, but I try to go back every now and then and reread it as we move from stage to stage. We're exiting stage 1 just a little over schedule, as can be expected with the first iteration of anything this substantial. And we're midway through stage 2. As you know, we were able to start working on some of the early scenarios as NISO released them, allowing for this overlap that you see here. And now we're really in the throes of it, fully developing all 3 scenarios for network development and getting ready for the longest and probably most important stage 3, where we start that local assessment, moving into all of those analyses we described before, which are going to help us define the solutions that make sense, at least on the local system, for the next couple stages, where we review our preferred solutions, do some least cost planning assessment, and prepare a report before we do it all again. So I'll pause. Questions and comments, jumping over to Q&A, and thank you again for everyone for the input so far, and thank you to the planners on the phone who helped me get out alive. So I'll open the floor to questions.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Skylar. Hey, Tom, a couple of quick questions on your couple of sensitivities you mentioned you're thinking about on the long-term duration storage. What's the maximum length of the storage capability? Is it 8 hours or is it longer?
I know we've been considering longer, but this has just started coming up in discussion, and something we wanted to curtail detailed discussion of until we got your input. So definitely interested in input there, but open the floor up to anyone else from the JU who has some detailed thoughts there, or staff.
Yeah, our capacity expansion results did allow for both 4 and 8 hour duration storage at this point. And the results that were shared today for scenario 3 as well as the results that are posted for scenarios 1 and 2, they kind of show the breakdown of what the build out was in each of those years for between 4 and 8 hour duration. In general, it looks like somewhere around 70 to 80% of what is built is 4 hour duration, and then the remainder is 8 hour duration that's usually built in those later years of the analysis. And so we're hopeful that we can kind of use those capacity expansion results in terms of, zonal breakdown of 4 versus 8 hour storage in the later stages. There's no additional long duration storage in the modeling yet, so that's something we might be considering as a sensitivity later.
Okay, thanks, Skylar. And then 2 other questions or maybe comments. One on the potential imports from other pools. I would just say that maybe some additional research on that, because what we've been seeing is that the import activity is lessening, especially during kind of regional seasonal effects like extreme cold or extreme heat. And then the more recent PJM capacity outcome, all those, maybe take those into consideration as you think about it. And then lastly, on the nuclear front, it looks like there have been a couple of other announcements more recently. So maybe that is something to consider as a sensitivity. So those are just some points to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We know there's a lot that can change here, especially based on the how fast our neighbors also decarbonize. You're right. If we all are buying wind, solar, and offshore wind, and we all are fairly close together in this northeast area, there's not a lot of power to go around necessarily, depending on the types of build outs we're looking. So that's definitely something to evaluate in the future. Raya.
Hi, I was interested to know what will the process be for getting additional and time frame for getting additional recommendations, potentially changing some of these scenarios. I also just have to say I would be completely against adding nuclear as a sensitivity. I think that's completely out of bounds, but I'm just registering that. But my question is about the process and time frame.
Yeah, so we're starting the discussion today on those additional sensitivities. Any ideas folks have today based on what they've seen on the scenario 3 results, and anything that you remember from scenario 1 and scenario 2? More than happy to hear those today, but we're also going to be following up after this meeting with an email requesting more input and suggestions for sensitivities, very similar to the way we requested input on the original scenarios. We've heard some feedback already on previous scenarios. For example, I know Bill Acker, I don't think he's on the call today, but on our previous call about scenario 2 results, he mentioned that a sensitivity with either long duration storage or changing the way the model sees representative days could have a significant impact on the build out based on how it sees storage. So those types of thoughts on how we could potentially change 1 or 2 things about a given scenario that might change the output significantly. Happy to hear those now or in response to the email that I'll be sending out later today. Yep, and then after that, we hope to give about a week to get responses there so that we can go quickly. I think Tom had mentioned the timing constraints we're under. We're already a little bit past when we were hoping to end stage 1. And we haven't yet even identified the final 8 sensitivities we want to run. So we're really hoping to lock down these sensitivities within the next week or 2 so that we can kind of provide that full list to the NYISO and get their modeling off and running, just so we have those results as soon as we can, because we are hoping that these sensitivities can inform what we're seeing in terms of solution development and the ultimate investment in transmission. And we're also moving quickly just in case one of these sensitivities seems to be almost a quote unquote better or quote unquote more realistic outcome than, say scenario 2, which has almost exactly the same renewable build out zonally with just a little bit more storage downstate. So that's kind of the reasoning, and I would say, email today, give about a week for input from the EPAC, and then we'll, make some decisions among the JU staff and NYISO and get those sensitivities defined and send an update to you all within the next 2 weeks.
All right, thank you very much.
Radhika?
I have a question on the citing methodology. I wasn't on the call representing AC New York when it was presented, but I know that there was a follow-up to be done on maybe once that that milestone is reached, on how the citing is done and releasing some additional information. So I was wondering at what timeline to expect for that data set or that information to be released. And maybe just if it wasn't clear, there was discussion about how to go about adding new generation based on the queue, I believe up to after stage 5 or 6. And after that, it was a selection that was based on available headroom, maybe production county information. But I think it was decided that that information will be released at some point with the EPAC, because where we add generation is important and can determine what constraints we'll be seeing in the model. So I think there was consensus about sharing that information. So I'm just asking about the timeline of that release.
Radhika, are you asking about the inputs that go into the citing methodology that we described, which most of which I think we have sooner rather than later, or are you talking about the actual output, how the generation ends up being cited that you're interested in seeing?
Yeah,
Just to
the
clarify.
output, essentially like how much generation you add, where you add it, which I thought
Okay, I know.
was discussed to be released.
I think that would make sense. We're in the process of that now. You know, for example, the scenario we just saw, we haven't even really done much with or started with because we're just getting our hands on it ourselves. So depending on the scenario, it may take some time, but that was right in the middle of those pieces. So I would expect later in stage 2, that would be something that we might have available and something we're just getting into now, but open to others input if I'm a little off there.
Okay, that makes sense. I understand that you are developing the models and making those decisions now. And I appreciate that this information will be provided at some point in the future. And related to that as well, I think it will be important, and I don't know if this is in the plan, to share, I think that the chart that you show with the timelines, Tom had identification of constraints, review of preferred solution, and local assessment. And the EPAC update, for instance, for stage 3, it's at the end of that. So I guess next year. So is the expectation that we won't have any information on what constraints you are seeing until that time frame? Or will there be some update mid-stage on what constraints are being identified across scenarios and zones?
Skylar and others, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I expect similar to how we've been doing, we'll have, you know, EPAC meetings intermittently in a way that's useful. So maybe not at quite the pace we've had them for scenario development or sensitivity input where we need a lot of interaction quite often, but I don't think a year between meetings is something that will make sense. I think either through DMM or through these meetings or some combination of which we'll share milestones at important milestones. So we won't have meetings just to say the same thing we had last meeting, but where there's milestones, we may have more. So I think these EPAC update interactions represent sort of the minimum as associated with the order requirements, not necessarily the maximum.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's pretty much exactly how I'm thinking about it. You know, there's, even within these stages, there's certain milestones that you could think of, like you mentioned, Radhika. It's just, these are the final details of the stage that we would definitely be sharing, but there might be some interim milestones within each of these that makes sense to have an EPAC meeting, and we'll schedule those as we get those results.
Okay, excellent. And I know this maybe was mentioned in the past, but I think there are differences in how we think about bulk versus high voltage, at least in regards to PPTN process and implications for that. I'm assume that in this area of preferred solutions, the joint utilities will look at both high voltage solutions and low voltage solutions for local constraints. Is that what will happen, or I'm just like, what will be the framework for developing a solution in regards to this high voltage, low voltage consideration?
Veronica, this is Jeff Marr from National Grid. I'll jump in here. Sorry, Tom, for cutting you off, but I'll offer that, really, I think the way that stage 5 is going to play out as we've started to work through, stage 1 especially, and look forward to stage 5, one way that I think that this could work out is the model is really going to focus on what projects are providing headroom at the lowest cost, right? So, because the model has to achieve policy, the model needs headroom to build generation, right? That's kind of one of these constraints that we've baked into the model, that there has to be headroom. So that's really the way I see this working out. So I think it's really up to the utilities to come up with the fit for purpose solutions that provide the most megawatts of headroom at the least cost. So the way I think about that is that everything is on the table, right? Advanced technologies, high voltage, really focused local or lower voltage projects, whatever is going to provide that headroom at the lowest cost, that's the solution that I think we'll be proposing.
Thank you. Good clarification. Thank you.
Hey, Chris, is that a new hand or is that hand still just up from your previous question?
Sorry, that's an old hand. I'll take it.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Are there any other questions right now or comments on what you've seen so far? Okay, then I will prompt some, and whoever's controlling the slides, could you go back to the potential sensitivities list just real quick? Because this is potentially this is not meant to be limiting, but this is potentially something to spark some thinking here. We've heard one comment or opinion on the nuclear opportunity, that it may not be a fit for this process. Since we already heard one there, is there any other comments on the value of exploring nuclear power as a D for the value of that type of a scenario?
I'm sorry, you're asking something of the group now?
Yep. This is just a question to the group to prompt more discussions. We do have 40 more minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that we can get a head start on developing any sensitivities, or at least the feedback to those sensitivities in this time that we have together.
If you could rephrase your question. Sorry, I don't
Sure.
think I.
So we have this list of potential sensitivities, which is not meant to be limiting. But since we have already gotten a comment from you, actually, Raya, about the value of maybe the nuclear sensitivity, I was going to just start with that bullet and see if any other folks had comments or feedback on whether they felt that a nuclear sensitivity, using nuclear as a candidate resource, would be valuable. And Raya, is your hand up for that?
No,
Question?
actually, no. So I'll.
Okay.
Hey, Skylar, Chris Wentland. Just on that point, what I think is at a minimum to investigate the amount of nuclear activity that's occurring globally. And just more recently, they announced a project, I believe, in Wyoming and Montana, and then another one in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And then there was some refurbishment that went on in Ontario. So maybe just looking at that to get a sense as to the activity level. And then the other core issue would be like what timing would you incorporate if in fact you even considered it?
Right. Very good points.
Skylar, Jeff Marr from National Grid. Very, very much want to make clear that I'm very technology agnostic. I don't really care what the specific technology is. I will say that NISO's SRO was somewhat informative on this topic. In one of their sensitivities or one of their scenarios, I believe they use deferred generations that are kind of generic options. But one of them was a high capital cost but low operating cost, which nuclear may fit in that bucket. High capital, high upfront cost, but low operating cost. And their model was building some of that generation. Now, it doesn't have the same behavior as like our existing nuclear fleet, right? It wasn't like a 90% capacity factor, but that result did suggest that some more base load type generation may have value. So it would be interesting to see in this sensitivity if that continues to be true with our scenarios. It may or may not be, it's hard to say. But from a completely technology agnostic perspective, base load generation may have some value.
Monica?
I actually have maybe a clarification point to ask on the modeling imports exports beyond 2040, what that means. Sorry if I missed that earlier, but what do we mean by that?
I definitely blew through that. I think what we're talking about is really an increase maybe in imports that might be reflective of, or exports that generally might be reflective of changes in interregional transmission. So we're looking probably at federal policy and even local interest in, we saw Northeast Interregional Collaborative, I think there's more words in that, but release in MOU, and they're starting to think about it. So we put this bullet on there to represent if there are substantial changes in those import-export limitations based on transmission build-out that might be spurred by some of this activity, that we might want to consider that in our models if it'll have a substantial change in any of the build-outs.
Thank you. And do you see this as something that could be supported with new transmission, interregional transmission, or is it to see how maybe the transmission bill could change if you allow more imports, exports?
We're definitely open to input on, I
on-
think we're open to input on both. That's sort of why we left this bullet very high level, is it could represent a number of different things, including both of what you mentioned.
Okay.
But open to others on the call if you have some input or specific thoughts on that.
This is Raya. I wanted to say a few things. I think we will want to follow up with some more suggestions on imports and exports. And also, I want to just get back. First of all, Skylar, my comment about nuclear, please don't use that as a predicate for why this is being discussed here so favorably, apparently. I guess I'm actually just really floored that this process is thinking about and encouraging and finding solutions to model, such far off problematic technologies when we have gotten no traction on any even high level willingness to capture even locationally or even putting a place marker through various suggestions that have been asked for disadvantaged communities. In fact, we've even been, we've asked just, we're going to put out a study soon by the Columbia graduate students that just have some suggestions about equity and justice and transmission planning. And one of them is just making sure that it's an input into the process that, we asked for at the beginning, in our first meeting, that, the CLCPA's policy mandates, to equity and justice be included in the mandate for this process. And we were rebuffed there. And so all of a sudden we're taking our time to talk about something so theoretical that seems to have so much, enthusiasm as, a fall solution like nuclear when we have gotten nowhere on some of the really basic stuff. So it's sort of a, orange and apples comment, but it's very distressing. So I guess my question is what I think would be a great thing is to be able to have more discussion and process on how we can make sure that we're addressing and tracking, making sure that the CLCPA's justice mandates are an input to this process, you know, at this level. That would be great if we could continue a discussion on that. If not now, in the near term.
Sounds good. Any other comments on the long duration storage as a candidate resource? I know we talked about that briefly previously because this is one of those sensitivities that could really change a build out. We recognize that even without the availability of long duration storage, the model is already building almost all of the renewables it possibly can. So there's a chance that long duration storage itself could be limited by the availability of in-state resources to charge it. But at the same time, you know, long duration storage may provide the ability to eliminate the need for so much electrolysis and so much hydrogen production in the state. And so there's some trade-offs there. You know, renewables that are currently going to electrolysis could go to long duration storage instead. So that was just one thing that could potentially change the build out and the DEFR needs. Any comments or ideas around how that could work or whether that's a valuable sensitivity? Okay, we'll make sure that Bill Acker is on that email chain because I'm pretty sure he's going to have some ideas on long duration storage. We've talked about most of these at this point. I know we'll probably have more information about additional bulk interface relaxation sensitivities once we've seen the first copper sheet analysis. And then hopefully these spark some ideas for future sensitivities that you all can respond to emails to the email with. I'll give maybe another 10 or 15 seconds, seeing if anybody else has any ideas that they want to discuss on this call today. Otherwise, we'll close and do the rest by email for the rest of the week. All right, with that, I think we'll close today's EPAC meeting. You can expect an email from me shortly. As always, we're open for any emails on the EPAC at dps.ny.gov, and we will talk to you all soon and hope to schedule another meeting in the next few weeks. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you.